IPOT.com podcast.
Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com podcast, looking at cannabis news, stocks to watch, as well as insights from thought leaders and experts. In today's podcast, I interview Darryl Jones, the president and CEO of Isracann Biosciences Incorporated, trading on the CSE as IPOT, where we discuss the company's recent news as well as the cannabis industry based out of Israel. So today I'm here with Darryl Jones, who is the president and CEO for Isracann Biosciences. So Darryl, for any of our listeners who are unfamiliar with Isracann, could you maybe just give a brief background of the company, maybe leading up to the most recent listing on the CSE?
Yeah, sure, Taylor. Appreciate it. Happy to. So Isracann Biosciences is the first pure-play cannabis firm to list in Canada, and we think that's a big feather in our cap because the first mover advantage is key and has shown great returns for other companies in similar jurisdictions, like Chiron in Colombia, ICC in Uruguay, and so that's a big opportunity for us to capitalize on. Israel itself is a phenomenal place to operate and is shown to be a leading cannabis research hub of the world. And so, we started venturing out of Canada, call it 2 or 3 years ago. Market was saturated. We were looking to replicate the model similar to Canada. And we uncovered Israel and saw that the same movie is playing out there that played in Canada for, call it 4 or 5 years ago. So very similar to 2014. We saw a seismic shift in terms of government sentiment changing. They started opening the doors to domestic production, and here we are today. We went public on the CSE under IPOT. We raised $10.1 million, and the focus of the business is ultra low cost production. Really, the climate over there lends itself to sub sort of 50 to 60 cents a gram Canadian production, and that's where we are focusing on building out the business, and we're very excited.
So obviously, you mentioned there Israel's been known for its R&D side of the industry, but entering into sort of the production and supply side now, what are the major sort of differences you're noticing between being based out of Israel and comparing yourself to the Canadian market, for instance, when it comes to regulations, or also comes to infrastructure and what you have to focus on in that element?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, you mentioned the R&D side, and it's a cannabis research capital. So for 50 years they have been building out the cannabis platform on the R&D side. One of the only countries that has research licenses. So they've got a huge leg up on majority of the other sort of air quote this mature cannabis markets. And really the opportunity and the differentiation between, current marketplaces and Israel, it's very similar to Canada in a lot of respects. You still have to go through the licensing process. You still have to obtain GAP, GSP. If you're not familiar, that's good agricultural practices and good security practice approvals. And from that, you push forward into the ultimate cultivation. So as it stands today, Israel's cultivation is still, I think, sort of in the fledgling industry. There's about 10 producers, but most of them are producing under an old model, very similar to Canada's switch from the MMAR to the MMPR. They're just now spooling up into this sort of internationally accepted pharmacy model. And we think this is a very, very good thing for the domestic market. So we're pressing forward with the necessary approvals, working with the government bodies. We've already achieved some of the initial approvals. Obviously, have our licenses to be able to begin building and then ultimately begin cultivating here, in 2020.
When you're comparing it as well to, like I said, the U.S. or Canadian markets with sort of how fast the licensing process moves along, as well as you're the first movers there, there's only X amount of producers in that space so far. Are you finding that because there's not a huge amount of competition and it's not on the radar as much, that it's a little easier to get your licenses and move into development?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we're dealing with a government, so yeah. It's still the same as Canada, still the same as the U.S. You've got challenges. You've got bureaucracy. Israel is very similar in that regard. So, there is competition internally, but there's an opportunity to take advantage because some of these companies are, missing the mark on product quality and very similar to Canada, missing the mark on supplying the internal demand. So, we're happy to be there. Obviously, we bring, the 10 years of sort of Canadian capital markets and grow expertise. And we think that paired with the Israeli sort of R&D, it's a very, very complementary mix. And, we're sort of pressing on. It's about a 6 to 8 month time frame we're looking at right now. Obviously, that's a bit of a fluid sort of time range, but we're expecting, like I said, sort of mid 2020 to be capitalizing on the internal demand within Israel.
Absolutely. So I know that your company is focused on supplying both the EU markets as well as the domestic market in Israel. When we're looking at the EU specifically, is it specifically the price point that's going to be separating you mostly from other competitors in that market, or where do you see your biggest competition coming from, and how do you sort of overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, look, our focus obviously is to be an international company, a player in, the largest market we see, which is Europe. I think some of the stats we've seen are $64 billion market by 2028. So there's plenty of pie to go around there. We don't want to overlook the domestic market because we see this as potentially, 200,000 patients in the next sort of 5 years. The growth rate internally in Israel is phenomenal and one of the highest per capita cannabis use countries in the world, actually the highest per capita use. So, we see an opportunity internationally as that opens, but also domestically to take advantage and really build the sort of brand and the backbone. And, ultimately, I think you touched on it, the price point is crucial. I mean, a lot of companies have struggled internationally or, Canada, the U.S., to be able to deliver low cost, high quality cannabis. And, being that Israel has, ideal temperature, humidity, 300 days of sun, we believe if, we're producing in this sort of commoditized market at, 40, 50, 60 cents a gram Canadian, we can be a dominant player in the international landscape. So that's going to be our biggest driver, is this low cost sort of production profile, and then bringing some, novel Israeli and Canadian genetics and expertise to this platform.
When we're looking at the EU marketplace as well, I know you mentioned that a lot of these companies that are already in Israel are now having to sort of switch over to almost put themselves in a almost like pharma grade level operation. Is that what the demand you're seeing for the EU market is it's moving away from dried flower and more towards different forms or functions of the cannabis products?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, to sort of project out what the market's going to like. Right now, the market is still dried flower for a lot of these countries. I mean, that's the input product for a lot of the current products. So ultimately, that's the spot we want to be in to begin our sort of process. We ultimately know farmers are, they're not the ones that ultimately win in this game. Every country in the EU has their own standards and they have their own regulations. A lot of them don't have domestic grows, so they have to rely on other countries. And, obviously pushing towards this, GMP standardization for your post-harvest and packing facilities is the way that it's going to move because, everyone wants the best product. And when you start moving up the value chain to this pharma phase, they're going to want the best product at the, the best possible prices, because when you start breaking it down into medicine or other products like that, low cost producer is going to win. All your input costs are going to be dictated by what the raw product goes in at.
As well, looking at, like I said, the EU marketplace, how is the demand side right now for that industry, and is that growing? And as far as getting the international trade agreements with those different players there, are you finding that everyone's still looking to grab up as much product as possible, or has there been a slowdown, or is there an expectation that it's going to increase by a large number in the next little while?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think initially in this cannabis business, you've seen a land grab, right? And there's been a lot of companies, ideally, in Canada, that have gone out and spent a lot of money and bought up what was left of the distribution and accessing these sort of landlocked patient populations. So right now, we see that market. We think that market's going to be the second wave. Is sort of on the precipice. there's ample opportunity to be a player up there in the EU, excuse me. And really, it's just starting to break open. So, we're extremely excited to be sort of going live with our, business plan coincidentally with the export law, hopefully being passed sort of mid 2020, which will then allow, I think, a wave of low cost producers, in and around Israel to be able to supply some of these sort of underserved patient populations.
Absolutely. And speaking of the sort of low cost production market, what are the other sort of markets you're looking at of supplying besides the EU, if any? And also, what are the sort of the biggest other competitors you see coming up in the low cost areas of the world?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we're focused on Israel and the EU as it stands. I mean, as stuff comes open, we have to see if it's a fit. I think this sort of model of low-cost regional centers will supply, the surrounding areas. Obviously just due to economies of scale and shipping and what have you. So our focus will be generally around where we are. Look, I mean, you've got Greece and Macedonia all trying to come online. There's African production that that has been sort of in the background for a while, Lesotho. So I mean, there's plenty of competition, but really the differentiator for us is, we believe as a brand, Israel stands alone, right? If you're talking about 50 years of cannabis research, you've got this back end research and development and history of being a cannabis sort of nation under the radar. We think that's going to stand up far better against most of the other low-cost producers, where that's really all they stand on is low-cost production.
Because Israel is so well known in the international community for its research over the past, few decades. When we're looking at that, is there any proprietary methods or extra elements that you can add to your production capabilities that are based out of that come from that research or come from that area of Israel?
Yeah, look, Israel is a very, very well-established country, self-sustaining. They're leaders in the space in agriculture, water reclamation, and obviously cannabis. So, we are constantly evaluating new opportunities that will add to the grow. And then on the flip side, we're also looking at novel product development, new sort of partners, technologies on extraction, so we can be different, right? This is the big thing in the cannabis market today, is you've got a lot of companies that look the same and sort of sound the same, but there's really no differentiation. So, being in Israel for the past, let's call it 2 years, we've made inroads. We've seen a lot of very interesting technologies, and ideally, the game plan is to bring some of these into the fold over the next, call it 18 months, to differentiate our company on the international landscape.
So I guess just in final thoughts, other than what you've just mentioned there, because I think that does almost answer this question, but is there anything else investors can be looking forward to for Isracann for the next coming months, besides, like I said, what you've already sort of mentioned and the development you have currently in place?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've put together sort of a path to success as to what we believe is going to be needed to be executed on. I encourage everyone to go to the website, Isracann.com, get the presentation. There's a timeline slide in there. It outlines, what we've put together as this sort of path to success. So we're moving through that. We had some news out, I guess it was Tuesday of this week, regarding the cultivation licenses, our partner there, and we're going to continue moving down this path and executing architectural designs, looking to establish the business in Israel, and then internationally, as this market opens, we're expecting to execute on some very large opportunities that I think will change the sort of the dynamic of the company.
Well, thank you so much for talking today, and I think you gave a lot of good insight on what's going on based out of the Israeli market right now.
Wonderful. I appreciate the time. It's great to be a part of it.
Once again, that was Darryl Jones, the President and CEO of Isracann Biosciences Incorporated, trading on the CSE as IPOT. To find out more information about Isracann Biosciences, you can click the link attached in the article or visit their website at Isracann.com. That's all for today's podcast. Enjoy the rest of your week. Today's podcast featuring Isracann Biosciences is a paid-for distribution. To find more about our disclaimers and disclosures, visit investorideas.com. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.